Through 3 weeks in the Big Ten, who do you think are the best teams? I can tell you what I think the hierarchy is in the Big Ten through 3 weeks in. Ohio State is clearly number one in the Big Ten. But who's number two? Who's number three? I mean, who is in that tier below Ohio State, and what does the rest of the Big Ten look like? I have Penn State at number 2, behind Ohio State, and I have Oregon following them closely behind at number 3, Michigan at 4, Nebraska at 5, Rutgers at 6, USC at 7, Iowa at 8. About Michigan through Iowa, so Michigan, Nebraska, Rutgers, USC, and Iowa, those teams I'd all put in a similar camp. USC probably has the highest ceiling out of all of those teams, but they've also only played 2 games, and I don't know how physical they are in the trenches. I would say every team in their tier, USC's, is more physical than they are, but USC has far better quarterback play, wide receiver play, and on average a more talented roster than anyone surrounding them in what I would call, honestly, tier 3. Penn State and Oregon, I think, are in a very clear tier 2. I think it's Ohio State, and maybe Oregon and Penn State can compete with Ohio State depending on how they manage their roster and how they play, and, Penn State versus Ohio State and Oregon versus Ohio State. Those 3 games, I think, will decide the conference. Michigan versus, Oregon, Michigan versus Ohio State, and Michigan versus USC. Michigan is going to be this team that at best could sneak into the college football playoff. I don't think they're a factor right now in winning the Big Ten. They could be a factor in deciding who reaches Indianapolis. Maybe they beat Oregon after Ohio State already beat the Ducks and they kick Oregon out of the conference championship race. I don't know, but I can't see Michigan winning the Big Ten. The only teams I can see winning the Big Ten at this point are Oregon, Penn State, and Ohio State. That's the top 3, I think the clear top 3, and I think Ohio State's clearly number 1. You look at what they did to Western Michigan and what they did to Akron in the second half and compare their 8 quarters of play to the Big Ten's 8 or 12 quarters of play, depending on the team and whether they hit a bye in week 3 or not. Well, I would be pretty hard-pressed to say that anyone other than maybe, just maybe Penn State or Oregon is better than them. And I think they're number 1. I think it's fairly obvious. You look at going back to tier 3. I'm bouncing all around the place, but I don't know how you don't do that when looking at power ratings, especially this early, because, well, we have a small sample size. So there's an argument for Illinois to be higher than 11th, or for USC to be 4th, or for Nebraska to be 4th. I mean, I think there's an argument for Iowa being higher than 8th, even though they already do have a loss and their defense has some questions. I just think that tier 1, it's Ohio State. Tier 2, it's Penn State and Oregon. Michigan, Nebraska, Rutgers, USC, and Iowa, that makes up tier 3. Michigan State, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Maryland make up tier 4. Washington's in kind of a weird spot. I feel like they make up like tier 4B or tier 5. I don't feel like anyone is in Washington's tier. Like they don't fit in the Big Ten. They clearly have a lot of work to do, but they're way better than Purdue, Northwestern, and UCLA, who make up tier bottom feeder, also known as, well, tier 5. 3 is the most interesting tier to me, because teams in tier 3, all of them can build strong momentum for 2025 outside of maybe Iowa because of how senior-laden they are. For Rutgers, they have enough recruiting and enough of, well, a staff that doesn't include Kirk Ferentz. That I'm saying that because Kirk Ferentz could retire after this year. Greg Schiano's probably going to be at Rutgers for a while. So Iowa's kind of that weird team inside of tier 3, but USC, Rutgers, Nebraska, and Michigan, depending on how they finish this season, we could be looking at them in a negative light or just a mediocre light, like kind of not looking at them at all, just neutral, entering 2025. Some, like Michigan and USC, and maybe Nebraska, with Rutgers, with how easy their schedule is and how much they brought back, I find it to be hard pressed that anyone would look at Rutgers in a negative light unless they went 5-7, which I don't think will happen. But these teams have high ceilings and low floors, and we could be talking about Michigan potentially winning the Big Ten again in 2025, depending on how they finish out this year. Or we could talk about, Sharon Moore's going to get fired soon. It's a question of when rather than if. For Lincoln Riley, it could literally be the same thing. College football playoff and Big Ten title contender next year, or maybe Riley's on the hot seat. For Nebraska, I don't think it's as extreme on the low end. I don't think Matt Rule will be on the hot seat in 2025 because they can just go 6-6 or 7-5, and he's improved compared to his previous season. But for Nebraska, you could talk about them being back or being legitimately back and competing for the Big Ten championship and college football playoff next year. For Rutgers, you could be talking about them as a long-term Big Ten sleeper, a long-term dark horse with how well that they're recruiting and clearly how they have developed rather well and I think formed themselves and evolved into being a formidable, classic Big Ten style team. Or if they finish 6-6 or 7-5, maybe it's just, well, they're Rutgers. They'll be competitive, but their schedule completely determines their season. And with Iowa, if the offense continues to improve and the defense shores up some things and they go 10-2, or maybe they compete with Ohio State and Kirk Ferentz returns and Brennan Sullivan looks to take the reins next year, maybe there could be some offensive excitement about Iowa. It's pretty weird. And then for Michigan State and Indiana and Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Maryland, Washington, those are other teams that, depending on how they finish out this season, there could be some optimism or a severe case of pessimism entering 2025. I'm the highest on Michigan State. I'm pretty high on Illinois next year just because of how young they are. Wisconsin, I'm a bit uncertain, but we'll have to see how they finish off this year. Minnesota, I'm pretty uncertain too. I think Loxley long-term at Maryland will be fine. Indiana, I expected them to go bowling this year, but they look a lot better than just a bowl team, especially factoring in the fact their schedule's easy. So, again, we'll have to wait and see with a lot of these teams. Many of them don't even have strength of schedules that are anywhere close to top 25 right now. Big Ten conference play is going to determine a lot. And speaking of Big Ten conference play, I have Penn State still going 12-1, 9-0 in conference. I think that Penn State is a team with Andy Kotelnicki that will show up, ironically enough, in big games, at least on offense. They don't have the talent to crush Ohio State, and I don't think they have the coaching to either. Penn State is not going to do it to Ohio State what Michigan did to them in 2021 and 2022. But they still host the Buckeyes. They have, I think, the coordinator edge over the Buckeyes for offensive coordinator, for defensive coordinator that goes Ohio State's way. And Penn State returns a lot of experience, a lot of talent. We've seen Drew Aller and Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen take steps forward this year. The offense looks new and reformed, and I'm not backing off of my Penn State prediction consequentially, even though Ohio State's objectively looked better than them through 3 weeks. But keep in mind, I had Ohio State power rated ahead of Penn State to begin the season, and I still had Penn State beating them and reaching Indy. I have Penn State losing in Indianapolis, though, to a rematch of the Ohio State Buckeyes, who I have winning the Big Ten, going 12-1, 8-1 in Big Ten conference play. I think it's Penn State and Ohio State going to Indianapolis, and I think that Ohio State gets that head-to-head tiebreaker over Oregon and Iowa, who also go 8-1 in conference. Iowa still has, I think, an elite defense. I just think they have some things in the secondary they have to work out. But through these first 3 weeks, Georgia has a really good defense. Michigan's is disappointing. Iowa's is disappointing. Penn State, I think, just had a fluke performance against Bowling Green. Ohio State's looks as advertised. We may have a weaker season, not just overall, but also on defense in the Big Ten, but also in the college football world compared to last year, where Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State, and Iowa all had elite defenses. and Clemson was up there too. Iowa, I still have faith in their defense. Their offense has taken steps forward. For Oregon, if they play more like they did against Oregon State for the rest of the year, they could win the Natty, but you got to have more consistency than just one great game. USC, Nebraska, Rutgers, Michigan, Indiana, those are all, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Notice how I have Michigan at 8th in my Big Ten predictions, like projections for the end of the season, but I have them behind Nebraska, Rutgers, and USC. A big part of that is that Rutgers, Nebraska, and USC don't face both Ohio State and Oregon in the regular seasons. They have easier schedules than Michigan does. They also had easier non-conference schedules than Michigan did. And as I said in my USC versus Michigan preview and prediction, I think Michigan is a team with a lot of potential, like very high potential. A elite staff would make Michigan into a top 10 team based off of the talent they have, even with the handicap they have at quarterback. But I don't trust Michigan's staff to utilize said potential. So I think Michigan will play USC extremely competitively and potentially beat them. In fact, I think the odds that Michigan beats USC are quite high. They could do the same to Oregon. Ohio State's a different animal. Yes, it's a rivalry, but I don't think Michigan has a shot to beat Ohio State currently. That's why I have Michigan at 8-4, 6-3, despite having them number 4 in power ratings. You look at Rutgers, Nebraska, and USC. Those are all teams that can contend for the college football playoff due to their schedule, the fact that they all have great coaching staffs, and they have their own non-negotiable. For Nebraska, it's their defensive line, and it's their punishing rushing attack, and potentially Dylan Raiola. You look at Rutgers, it's their punishing rushing attack, their offensive line, and I'd say their defense and special teams. And for USC, it's their receivers, it's their quarterback, and the fact that while their defense is not a top 10 unit, they do have a top 5 defensive coordinator in D'Anton Lynn, who can more than compensate for at least many minutes and quarters of every USC football game the discrepancies that his defense faces compared to others. He can make up for the lack of developed talent due to Alex Grinch, I think in a better way than a lot of defensive coordinators can, both in the Big Ten and nationally. You look at Indiana. Indiana can go 10-2. I have them still going 8-4, but they could go 10-2, and that would be pretty phenomenal in year one with Curt Cignetti, his staff, and much of his roster being made up of transfers. But I think they have the coaching staff, the cohesion, the passion, and also the weapons at wide receiver in particular, and the defense up front to get that done with the schedule they have. And then Michigan State, Wisconsin, Illinois, those are teams that can pretty easily go bowling. Wisconsin, maybe not so easily, but I still like Wisconsin's staff, and I think Alabama is better than any team in Big Ten Conference play for the Badgers. And the Badgers did show that they, while far from perfect against Alabama's defense, they can run the ball, and they do have a receiver that can even get yards after catch against Alabama's defenders, who are significantly bigger and larger and faster and more explosive than Wisconsin's offensive players. So Wisconsin can still go bowling. Michigan State can go 9-3 in my mind. Illinois can go 7-5, maybe 8-4, but I need to see more from their rushing offense, which has looked disappointing so far this year. And Washington, Minnesota, Maryland, Purdue, UCLA, and Northwestern are kind of at the bottom. They're like the chunk of chili. They're like that. I don't know what you call it, that dirty slab at the bottom of the chili pot. So again, for power ratings and also record projections, I have Ohio State at 1 in my power ratings, Penn State at 2, Oregon 3, Michigan 4, Nebraska 5, Rutgers 6, USC 7, Iowa 8, Michigan State 9, Indiana 10, Illinois 11, Wisconsin 12, Minnesota 13, Maryland 14, Washington 15, Purdue 16, Northwestern 17, 18 is UCLA. As for my record projections, I have Penn State going 12-1, 9-0 in conference play, losing to number 2 Ohio State in Indianapolis, who goes 12-1, wins the Big Ten with an 8-1 regular season record. Oregon's at 3, 11-1, 8-1. Iowa's at 4, 10-2, 8-1. USC's at 5, 10-2, 7-2. Nebraska's at 6, and Rutgers is at 7, also with 10-2, 7-2 conference records. Michigan and Indiana are 8-4. Michigan is just at number 8 because of their 6-3 conference record, while Indiana has a 5-4 conference record. Michigan State, number 10, 7-5, 4-5. Wisconsin, 5-7, 3-6. Illinois, 6-6, 3-6. Washington, Minnesota, 4-8, 2-7. Washington just gets the tiebreaker due to the tougher schedule. 13th, Minnesota's 14th. Maryland is 4-8, 1-8 at 15th. Purdue is 2-10, 1-8 at 16th. UCLA is 1-11, 0-9 at 17th. And Northwestern is 2-10, 0-9 at 18th. So those are my Big Ten power ratings and record projections. Again, subject to change. We're only 3 weeks in, about to be 4 weeks in, and I have a feeling that we're going to be learning a lot more in this next week, 2, maybe 3, and when week 7 comes around and we see Oregon versus Ohio State, we're going to be learning a lot in not just that game, but that week as well. Thank you to my Patreon members for sponsoring this video and channel. I want to give a shout out to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman Patreon members at $25 a month. If you sign up as a Heisman for 6 months at $25 a month, you will get signed free College Football with Sam merchandise of your choice delivered to you, plus access to my weekly college football picks straight up and also against the spread. You get access to the picks, just not the signed merchandise if you're an All-American member at $10 a month. Thanks to Chris Slayton, Little OH, Ismar, Tyler Nye, and Chilton Cush for being All-American members. And if you just want your name featured at the end of every video with a shout-out, sign up as an All-Conference member for $5 a month. Thank you, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Steele, Austin Christmas, and Shania Cockrell for being All-Conference members. The links to my merchandise store and my Patreon page, both ways to support the channel, are in the description and also down below in the pinned comment. And I also encourage you to join my Discord via the link in the description and also in the pinned comment. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all soon. Bye-bye.